This week marks the release of the newest set for Magic the Gathering, Arena, Jumpstart Historic Horizons. The return of the Jumpstart mix-and-match formula was a welcome sight, and the introduction of some Modern Horizons cards into the historic format was also a thing that happened. But by far the most attention-grabbing and controversial elements of this new set were the brand new digital-only cards. With new mechanics like Conjure and Seek, Magic the Gathering has taken a step into the future with mechanics that, for whatever reason, could never be done on physical cards. We all knew this was coming, but the execution of this brave new design space perhaps raises even more questions for Magic's digital future. Today, we embark on another mechanical deep dive, this time into the new mechanics of Jumpstart Historic Horizons. Amidst the accusations of, quote-unquote, we Hearthstone now boys, there are legitimate critiques to be made of the new Jumpstart digital cards. But in order to reach them, we have to examine each of the three mechanics in turn, and ask ourselves the following questions. Firstly, what does this mechanic contribute to the game of Magic? Secondly, could this mechanic, or a version of it, exist in paper? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is the mechanic in the spirit of the Magic rules? To go along with these three questions, we have three main mechanics to examine, as well as a few special outliers, because it wouldn't be a video on Magic rules if there weren't a few exceptions. The three main mechanics are Conjure, Seek, and Perpetual. Without further ado, let's take a look at Conjure. Conjure is a keyword action that instructs the player to create a copy of a named card and put it into a certain zone, most often the hand. For example, when Winged Steed Trainer enters the battlefield or attacks, its controller conjures a Stormfront Pegasus card into their hand. This new card acts exactly like any other card in your library. It can be cast, but it can also be discarded, resurrected, shuffled into your library, or even exiled. Conjure has its roots in two paper mechanics, tokens and wishes. Wishes can pull cards from outside the game, which has traditionally meant the sideboard for the purposes of tournament play. Those cards enter the game just like conjured cards do, but with most wishes you can pull any card or a card of a particular type. Conjure is therefore a little closer to tokens, particularly the cycle of token generators from Future Sight that create token copies of real cards. More recently, in fact very recently, Garth One-Eye from Modern Horizons 2 allowed players to copy spells like Shivan Dragon and Black Lotus, simply referring to them by name. So in one sense, Conjure isn't doing anything particularly new. Cards like Boneyard Aberration innovate on these ideas by conjuring cards into the graveyard, to later be reassembled, but beyond that, the differences here are mostly pretty subtle. It's rare that you'll want to use Sarkhan's second ability simply to get a card to discard to Tormenting Voice, for example. It would also be remiss of me to not mention Shoreline Scout, the merfolk creature that conjures a copy of Tropical Island into your hand. While it might initially be exciting to see digital copies of a reserve list card, it's hardly a substitute for an actual Tropical Island. Which brings us to the last question, is Conjure in the spirit of the Magic rules? Certainly it would be hard to use a card like Shoreline Scout in paper without resorting to proxies, since anyone who already has a tropical island certainly has a better use for them. But the considerable precedent of token wishes, Garth One-Eye, and even the new dungeon cards that enter from outside the game all pile up to make this mechanic not particularly offensive to paper sensibilities. That said, not offensive is not the same as necessary. From a design space perspective, Conjure is neither a great breach to the rules of the game, nor a particularly valuable addition. Seek. Seek, like Conjure, is a keyword action. When you seek a card, you search your library for a random card that meets the criteria and put it into your hand. The key word here is random. Don't get this confused with tutoring, because it's quite the step down. Skyshroud Lookout is a card that, upon entering the battlefield, will choose a random elf in your library and put it into your hand. Manor Guardian will do the same for both players, except it will choose a non-land card with mana value 2 or less. And Faceless Agent, well, we're going to come back to that one. There are only 5 cards that seek in the set, which perhaps indicates a tacit understanding of the power of tutelage. But when people are so quick to cry, "Magic, the Hearthstoning," mechanics like this are often why. Anything that introduces an element of randomness to the game has to be very careful not to receive backlash, as the dice rolling from the recent D&D set made plain. Ignoring for a moment the fact that Magic has always had elements of variance, Seek bears a resemblance to a particular Hearthstone mechanic: Discover. Cards with Discover provide the player with a choice of 3 options, which often have a restriction similar to Seek. However, when you discover a card, the options are not pulled from your deck, instead selected from all the possible cards in the format that your class could cast. Phew! That is probably the most Hearthstone card analysis, and first Hearthstone card analysis, and last Hearthstone card analysis that we have ever had on this channel. Let's get back to Magic the Gathering. It doesn't seem like a stretch to say that Seek was likely influenced by Discover, but by limiting it to cards in your deck, it ensures that each of the possible outcomes at least has some relation to your deck building ability. Nonetheless, there are some subtle issues with Seek that have to do with its viability in paper. One of the reasons that paper cards like Last One Standing are few and far between is that choosing things at random when you can't shuffle the options is logistically difficult. At first glance, Seek seems entirely reasonable in paper, if time-consuming. You would simply go through your deck and select all the possible options, shuffle them up, and add one to your hand. However, paper designs always need to take into account the possibility of intentional or unintentional cheating. The only way to confirm to your opponent that you are holding all the options in your hand is to reveal your entire deck, which is very explicitly not in the spirit of Seek. And in a tournament setting with open deck lists, revealing your entire library would be tantamount to revealing your entire hand, provided your opponent has pen and paper and a lot of patience. While this will only rarely have a practical impact on gameplay, the Seek mechanic points towards a common theme between all 3 digital-only mechanics: the ability to let the client do some of the work on your behalf. And the third mechanic is no exception. Perpetual. Perpetual is not a keyword, or a keyword action, or an ability word. In fact, it's not immediately obvious what Perpetual is. And given that the comprehensive rules won't be updated with the release of this set, it may not have a specific place in the rules of the game at all. Despite this complicated status, the practical upshot of the mechanic is pretty straightforward. A card that perpetually gains a power toughness change or an ability gains that ability forever. If a creature targeted with Davriel's Withering dies as a result, it has -1, -2, even as it changes zones. If it ever returns to the battlefield, it will have -1, -2 again, and probably die straight away. If Leonan's Sanctifier targets an Angel of the God Pharaoh in your hand, that card will have lifelink in your hand, on the battlefield, and in your graveyard. If your opponent targets your commander with Ethereal Grasp, and your commander later returns to the command zone and is recast, it will still have the abilities granted by Ethereal Grasp. The only 2 things that can remove the abilities are cards like Kenrith's Transformation, that remove everything, and the End of the Game. Of the 3 mechanics we've examined, this is probably the most straightforward to understand. It takes advantage of the digital client to remove the memory issues that would come with trying to keep track of which of your creatures has been hit with the baffling defenses, without a counter to mark it. But the oppressive nature of cards like Davriel's Withering on potential commanders means that both Davriel and his Withering have been banned in Historic Brawl preemptively. While those bans are probably the right call, it's important to remember that creating cards that can't be played in certain formats ought to be considered a failure for design. Like Sarkhan's Scorn, Perpetual cards only serve to take advantage of the client remembering certain things, which it can neatly display as blue text at the bottom of the card, or a handy badge on the left of the card. It's not that these cards could never be done in paper, just that they probably should not. And that's it! 3 mechanics which, when taken as a whole, don't actually seem particularly disruptive to the game at all. But as I mentioned, there are a few more digital-only cards we need to look at, and this is where things get a little difficult. The Outliers. I've identified 5 cards that use special new wording that only appears on those cards. While there are other unusual cards in the set, these are the ones that raise the most red flags with regards to preserving the spirit of Magic. They are Davriel, Soul Broker, Faceless Agent, Pool of Vigorous Growth, Sky Shroud Ambush, and Tome of the Infinite. To quickly scan through the things that make these cards odd, Davriel asks you to accept one of his offers and one of his conditions. Faceless Agent purports to count the most prevalent creature type in your library. Pool of Vigorous Growth creates a token of a random creature card. Sky Shroud Ambush is the first card to declare a winner of a fight. And Tome of the Infinite is an artifact that apparently has a spellbook within its rules. Some of these new rules terms are fairly straightforward. The winner of a fight is obviously the creature who didn't die, but doesn't immediately account for oddities like indestructible, toughness reduction, or the case of both creatures dying in the fight. Is that still a win? Similarly, Pool of Vigorous Growth doesn't specify whether the randomly chosen creature can be from any format, or just the one you're playing, and what the status of banned creatures might be. Faceless Agent looks for the most prevalent creature type, but how will the client behave in the case of a tie? Normally, we would have oracle text and rulings to clarify these things, not to mention the expertise of judges to enforce them. But in this brave new world, all we have is the oblique programming of the client. With some experimentation, the answers to each of these questions will likely be figured out soon. But should new players learning the game on what is apparently the most user-friendly platform for doing so really need to search through Reddit threads and Matt Tabak's Twitter replies in order to discover the behavior of their cards? It's well understood that Gatherer is not a priority for the digital team at Wizards. +2 Mace from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms is still not a part of their database. And Historic is not even a listed legal format. But the news that these cards won't be receiving Oracle entries to clarify the more unusual wordings is a serious loss. We used to have a saying on this channel that reading the card explains the card. But when you read Davriel, can we really say that doing so explains it? Davriel's deals and conditions were explained in the spoiler article from IGN, and are listed here if you need them. The article also explains that of these 8 deals, 3 will be chosen at random for you to then select one. It seems that the designers of these cards took even more inspiration from Hearthstone than we first thought. Perhaps even more shocking is this quote from the same article. Wizards of the Coast says this will open up new design possibilities, or even allowing it to modify Davriel's list substantially post-release. So not only are the effects of this card not explained anywhere, and we have to assume the same is true for Tome of the Infinite, but they're not even guaranteed to stay the same over time. Much like the main set mechanics, these cards forgo the spirit of the Magic rules in favor of letting the client just handle it. But if you take anything away from this video, let it be this. The Magic Arena program is not the same thing as the Magic the Gathering rules. One encourages a comprehensive and consistent system to facilitate gameplay. The other is a digital approximation that, even as it grows in popularity, moves further and further away from the system it was supposed to emulate. In the IGN article that revealed the set, Aaron Forsyth gave this quote: "We don't want to necessarily be designing the lowest common denominator version of Magic that has to work exactly the same on every platform." To that, I offer this rebuttal. Players want to play Magic digitally, and they want that game to be consistent with the game they know and love. That isn't the lowest common denominator thinking. That's just consistency and playing to your strengths. Forsyth later describes the set as a quote-unquote new frontier of design space, implying that Jumpstart Historic Horizons is only the beginning of digital-only design. And that may be true, but as well as a new frontier, I can't help but see it as a point of no return for Magic Arena. One of the biggest problems in Commander is Commander players.
Whoa, no, Prof.
No?
Well, yes, but more specifically, one of the biggest problems in Commander is other players' decks.